I just get furious. I get furious about this topic. This is The Payoff with me, Sylvia Jeffreys. Georgie Dent, it is so nice to be able to pin you down for 45 minutes and not the usual 5-minute blur that we have on today. Extra. Thanks for coming in today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Well, in the intro of this episode, we spoke about motherhood sharpening your potential. So on a personal level for you, is that something that speaks to you? Do you feel like it has sharpened you in some ways?
I think that it's really easy to overlook the strength and resilience that parenting requires. You know, I think it's really easy to believe that parenting is something that happens behind closed doors, that it's so easy, that it comes naturally. Whereas I think it actually is one of the most consuming, demanding jobs that exists. And so I would say in that way, I think it probably has sharpened me because our eldest child is about to turn 15. And so it has been 15 years of learning. And I think one of the things with little children is that it is never static. It changes all the time. And I would say that really consistently. We've got 3 girls. They're all quite different. And I am always learning.
Every single moment of every day is a learning experience.
Yes.
And we often talk about the fact that it makes you a better multitasker and makes you more efficient with your time. I think in some ways it also gives you a different view of the world, which can help you in the workplace as well.
Yeah, definitely. And look, I just actually saw something yesterday that resonated with me, and it was a mum who's got 3 small children, and she was posting that the end of the holidays and the long weekends actually presents the opportunity for a rest, as she calls it, when she goes into the office for her days at work. And I remember when we had 2 little girls, I would go into work and there were these group of guys at work and they'd always look at me and they were like, "Georgie, you are always so happy when you walk into the office." Yeah. And I said, this is really the easiest part of my life at the moment. I come into the office and I know I'm very fortunate that I have always had jobs that I've actually loved. But there is something about the contrast when you are in the trenches, particularly with little kids. When you've got kids sort of 6 and under, you are in the trenches. And I think work does provide a break for a lot of people. And I think the other side to that is I know that since I have been a mother and I've been working, you're always on the clock. And so even though I would arrive at work and be happy because it was my sort of easier part of my day, I worked really hard because I knew I had a hard finish when I had to pick the kids up.
Oh yeah, holidays hit different with kids, don't they? It's not so much a holiday as just parenting in another location.
Yeah, with often additional chaos because kids are out of routine and you haven't got all of the usual
the toys and the
familiarity. Exactly. Yes.
Okay, so if you were to rewrite the CV for a parent, what would be the 3 main points?
I think that probably prioritization. I think that you do learn really quickly what matters and what doesn't. Not that it doesn't matter forever, but I do think, particularly when you have a newborn, for example, suddenly the only things that really matter is everybody being okay. The housework, it just genuinely doesn't matter. I always say that to friends or family if they're having a new baby. In those first 6 weeks, the only thing that matters is surviving. And I think that parenting continues in that vein, in that you do have to try and prioritize what really matters in this moment right now. And so I think for a lot of parents, you do have that skill. I do think there is probably a sort of turbocharge of productivity. I don't know if you can put that on your CV, but I do think that when you do have children, regardless of their age, when you are juggling caregiving and paid work, you do turn up and you don't skive off because you're there to make the time count.
Every minute counts.
Every minute counts. And so I think there is something in that about the productivity. And then I guess one of the other things that I would say is that parenting does require a lot of patience, resilience. You do have to get comfortable with discomfort because your children are going to be unhappy. They're not going to like all of your decisions. It is going to be a sort of constant moving feast. And I think there is something in that about being comfortable with things not going to plan.
You have to let go of control.
Yeah, I mean,
a little
maybe it
bit.
is around adaptability. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
It is you do have to be able to adjust, and you also have to be able to wake up and have one plan in mind and realize that that plan is no longer going to be the
No.
case. You're going to be moving to a different
And you're going to pick your
paradigm.
battles. If your child decides that they must wear the ugly Spider-Man t-shirt to a family dinner when you want them to wear their nice shirt, you're just going to let them wear the Spider-Man shirt and hope
Exactly.
that they don't turn their pasta over in the restaurant, because that would be the worst case scenario.
Yes.
Okay, so I think what's really interesting right now when you look at young Australians and family planning is the clearly declining birth rate. The Australian Bureau of Statistics reveals that women are having fewer children and starting families later than ever as well. What do we know about the declining birth rate and what's driving that?
So we know that it is significant and that it has been accelerating in recent years. We know that from the research that's available, we do know that it is the cost, first and foremost, that is actually causing parents or parents-to-be to contemplate not having a family or having fewer children than they would ideally like. And I think probably when we talk about the cost of raising children, it is really significant. And it is also inextricably linked with that other issue, which is tightly linked with the cost of living, which is around housing. So a lot of when there's been research done and surveys of people, not having a permanent residence is something that does put a lot of people off. And there is that sort of sense that when we buy something, then we could think about having our family. And because the cost of housing is so expensive in Australia, that's another reason why you can see couples putting it off. And then obviously the later couples start, then potentially the fewer children they're going to be able to have. So you've got, but I think you cannot overlook the financial implications that are driving that decline.
What is the cost of having a child? Can we put a number on it? Can we say how expensive it is to have a child today as opposed to 20 years ago?
We don't have a sort of accurate picture that we can point to. There's not a single number that you can point to. But what we do know, so at the Parenthood, we did some research 2 years ago that looked at the cost of having children. And we do have some factors here in Australia that make the out-of-pocket cost for having children significantly higher than in other countries. And that is things like
childcare.
Childcare is a big one. So families in Australia do, by global standards, pay some of the most expensive fees in the world for early education and care. But even before we get to that point, we don't have what you would describe as an adequate or generous paid parental leave scheme. So the Commonwealth scheme, it is currently 24 weeks that's paid at the minimum wage. And that is something that most Australian parents are entitled to. But the World Health Organization has been recommending 26 weeks as the minimum since the 1970s, purely as a health policy, because that is the time, the optimal time that after giving birth and recovering from giving birth and settling a newborn into learning the ropes of routine, that's the time frame that's needed as a minimum. And if you look in OECD countries, the average length that families have of paid leave is 53 weeks. So 26 weeks at minimum wage is a really significant, has really significant financial implications for families, because we know that because the cost of living and the cost of housing is so high, having a baby and stepping away from having a second income for two-income families, it's almost like jumping off a cliff. And you might be able to do it for a short period of time. But if you take that leap and you're barely able to cover the rent or the mortgage, and then when you think about returning to work, which you need to do because you need the income, but the cost of childcare is the equivalent of a second mortgage, it is really significant what it actually costs to have a baby. And they are some of the equations that families or families to be are doing when they're making those decisions.
And because quite often we're not living in the suburb or the city that we grew up in, so we're not living with the village around us. So the only option is paid support through daycare or a nanny or an au pair or whatever it is. I mean, that's a whole other topic in terms of, should shift workers have access to salary sacrificing to cover a nanny, something like that. That's something that doesn't happen here in Australia.
No, and it's also we don't we are sort of stuck in a place where, and I do think this is evolving and changing, but I think there is still a little bit of that sentiment out there that financial support for families, so for example, paid parental leave or subsidising early education and care or anything of that nature, is sort of perceived as welfare of some sort, or that it's sort of families are rorting the system.
Oh, does that make you so mad?
It does. Yeah, it does make me mad. And I think, again, it discounts the reality of parenting and its significance and its importance. But I think also, so it's interesting, last year the US Surgeon General put out a pretty compelling report in which he sort of sounded the alarm around the well-being and particularly the mental health of parents, because it is really clear that parents experience overwhelming stress in significantly higher numbers and proportions than adults without children. And there is a really clear link between the well-being of parents and the well-being of children. And in his report, he really calls for, and he frames the argument really well, that the reason we need to invest in things like decent paid parental leave and genuinely affordable quality early childhood education and care, and invest in workplaces actually supporting parents, all of that is actually an investment in the well-being of children and the future generation. It's not simply a personal responsibility that parents should be able to manage, because our lives have changed significantly. So when we polled 1,200 parents with children 6 and under about 18 months ago, 85% of those parents said to us they need 2 incomes just to meet the cost of living. And that was a national survey. So when we broke it down, it was over 90% for families that lived in metropolitan areas, but 85%, that is a significant proportion of families. And what does that mean? It means that there's not much wiggle room. And that's, I think, part of what the US Surgeon General is getting at, is that the demands on parents in terms of how they can support and be there for their children in the way they need to be, and participate in the paid workforce to the extent they need to provide for their children. There is a huge amount of pressure that puts on families, and there is a cost that comes with that.
Of course there is. And there's a huge emotional toll. That comes with that. There is a big discussion. This is really topical at the moment, the declining birth rate topic. You look overseas and there's examples like Hungary, who are now offering women who have 4 or more children no income tax for the rest of their lives, among other measures. In America, they're starting to look at ways to encourage women financially to have more children to boost the domestic population. This is all tied in with immigration discussions and debates and stuff as well. Where do you stand on those kinds of policies? Because on the one hand, something needs to be done to help to lift the birth rate, because there are productivity things that come with that, and supporting the aging population and benefits in that sense. But on the other hand, it feels like there's a wee bit of misogyny creeping into some of it.
Yeah, and I think that when you look at the sort of mini gestures, or the sort of, crudely, it's the sort of baby bonus but put into a different way, there's definitely some of those measures you can see there's a little bit of misogyny, and there's a bit of that thinking that, if we make her income tax inapplicable, she'll have more children, instead of looking at, hang on, well, in the vast majority of cases, there are 2 parents in families. And if both parents are interested in working and raising a family, how do we make it more accommodating for both parents to be able to work and care? And I know in so many of these conversations, we do resort to pointing to those clever Scandinavian countries where they have got the balance much better. It's not perfect, but they have really, it hasn't happened by accident. So countries like Sweden or Iceland or Norway or Denmark, they haven't accidentally stumbled upon more gender equal, caregiving.
Yeah.
They've achieved that through deliberate policy design. So in Sweden, they were thinking about this 30 years ago. How do we encourage more dads to take extended parental leave? They were already across the benefits to children and to mothers and to fathers' well-being when family units are supported. And so that's why they do have policies like really generous paid parental leave. That both mums and dads use as the norm.
How much do they get in Sweden?
It's about 2 years that can be used
Between the two of them?
Between the two of them.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's paid at a replacement salary rate.
Right.
So it's
So
not
not
even
the
just the
minimum
minimum
wage.
wage.
Wow.
And I think what that really points to is a country that has, over a really prolonged period of time, recognized that that is a valuable investment and that parenting isn't something that just happens behind closed doors that parents should manage individually by themselves, but actually it's a collective responsibility. And so you know this because I'm grateful that we get to speak fairly often about these sorts of topics, but at the Parenthood we campaign for 1 year of paid parental leave that's shared between parents. We've done research that shows that would put Australia in a world leading position. It wouldn't necessarily be the longest paid parental leave scheme, but if it was paid at a replacement wage rate and mothers and fathers, or both two parents, when there are two parents, are able to share that care, that would be a world leading policy. And at the Parenthood, our objective is to make Australia the best place in the world to be a parent and raise a child. And that is a pretty bold ambition.
But why wouldn't we aim for that?
Exactly. And this is what I've said. Australia has been world leading and is world leading in different realms. Why would we not seek to be world leading when it comes to how we support the future generation? And you can't support children if you're not supporting parents and caregivers.
Well, that's it. It's not just about the caregivers. It's not just about getting us back into the workforce. This is what is best for the child. And we know that, I mean, again, we speak about this so often on our show. The first 5 years of a child's life is so crucial, and doing what is best for them sets them up for the rest of their lives. So why do we not treat that more seriously? Why do we not invest more into that issue?
Yeah, and I mean, it's that thing when we sort of, that tension between front-ending an investment and back-ending an investment. And the thing is, investing in prevention is so much more effective. So, and by front end that investment, I mean actually in the early years. So we know that 90% of brain development occurs between 0 and 5. We know it is quite literally magical how you can set a little child up to realize their full potential in those early years if you do it right. And at the moment in this country, we have lots of conversations about a range of issues, but you think about the declining educational rates. If you think about youth crime, all of these issues. So Queensland, Griffith University put out some research at the end of last year that was the results of a 20-year study that showed an early years program had been designed for children from disadvantaged socioeconomic areas. And when children had the ability to participate in early education with that framework, they halved the rate of children who ended up in juvenile detention. And there's research like this all around the world. It's not the first piece of research that has shown us that. But we know that if we want to set children up to thrive and realise their full potential, which is in all of our best interests, socially and economically, we actually have to look at how we do support children and their parents and caregivers in those early years. And it is quite literally the way that we would change this country for the better.
Yeah, don't get me started on universal early education. We've already been down a few tangents. I've taken you on a little journey already, which I knew I would. But for those who are listening who are not familiar with the Parenthood, tell us what it is and how it came to be.
Yeah, so the Parenthood is a not-for-profit advocacy organisation. We represent about 85,000 parents and carers. I have been the CEO for 5 years, and I was on the board for a year before that. But the organisation itself is 11 years old, and it was really started to give voice to parents in recognition of the fact that parents are some of the most time-poor citizens in this country. They have a really their voices and perspective and role they play is really significant. But as a stakeholder group, there wasn't really a peak body, if you like. And certainly individual parents don't have the time to get themselves organised to necessarily campaign for this. So the Parenthood was started really to give voice to parents on issues that matter to children and young families. And so that is, that's who we are. And I absolutely love that I'm able to lead this organisation.
You're an amazing advocate for young parents and for young families, and you've helped to shape policy in this country already in this role in 5 years of it. And you really listen to the families who write into you, and you really listen to the issues. You're across the issues that affect families in Australia today, the burning issues for families. I imagine there are some stories that really resonate with you and stay with you. Is that the case? Is there one story that's really made it feel all worthwhile for you, this work?
Look, I have to say that when we have had some of the policy wins that we have had, and there have been some significant advancements around early education and even in paid parental leave, you know, the fact that superannuation is now going to be paid on paid parental leave was huge, and that is something that the Parenthood had been campaigning for since it first started. Those sorts of legitimate policy wins are incredibly heartening and very motivating. I think in terms of what I'm always struck by with the stories that we hear is not necessarily that there's one story that stands out. It's that there's 100 stories that are telling the same thing, really. They're painting a picture of life being so hard. And, you know, we've got on our website, we've got a particular section for stories because we think parents being able to tell their stories is in and of itself valuable. And you read those stories and you read how parents are bending over backwards just to create this patchwork of care that works for them. The financial reality, the logistical reality.
In my brain thinking about who's going to cover that and that and that.
Yeah, and also there is also a really legitimate conversation to be had about the increasing complexity of parenting. So we know this not just from early childhood education and care services, not just from schools, but also research from parents. Children are presenting with an increasing number of challenges, differences. There is, in the vast majority of households, most parents with young children have got or are carrying something that is a little bit outside the realm of what they might have expected.
Yeah.
And we do know that children are presenting at school and at early education and care and at home with significant behavioural challenges.
Yeah.
And all of that takes a lot of energy, resources, time to support kids through. And as we've spoken about, when you can identify differences or challenges earlier, you do have an opportunity to really support a child to thrive and realise their potential. But that requires the people around them having the ability, the time, the money, the right places to go to get the right help that they need when they need it. And so I think that's what I'm often struck by. And one of the things that I say to parents in our community and I say to families is, I think raising a child and raising a family feels really hard, but it's not hard because you're doing it the wrong way. It's hard because we haven't invested in the supports that parents and children need. So it's almost gaslighting, because I think, and I know this because I have done this, I still do this. It is so easy to feel when things are hard, it's because I'm making the wrong choices and I've done the wrong things, instead of being, no, actually, do you know what? It's really hard because we haven't invested in the things that parents and kids need.
Yeah. I'm just conscious that there might be some people listening to this who are weighing up starting a family, and we've made it sound really hard, that motherhood is really hard. It is the best goddamn thing that's ever happened to me in my life. I love motherhood. It is the greatest joy you could possibly experience as a human being. But Georgie is out here to make it easier for everyone, because it is hard, but it can be easier in this country.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that it is an extraordinary privilege to have children. And I think it does add so much to your individual life. And
Yeah.
my husband and I laugh. We spend so much time looking back at photos and
Yeah,
videos of
it's
when
the
our
best.
children were little. And every year you're doing it, thinking about the year
Yeah.
before. And there is so much about it that is, there just isn't anything else like
It's
it.
hilarious.
It is.
It's
It is
utterly
entertaining and
hilarious.
it's funny and it is so cute.
Yeah. And it's grounding and humbling,
Yes.
exciting, all of it.
But I do like what you've said. I don't want to say it's hard because it's a terrible thing to do. And it can be easier. And it needs to be easier.
Yeah. Georgie, if women were designing workplaces that were friendly for parents, what do you think they would look like?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think the answer is it's not so much how a workplace looks, but it's how a workplace feels. And ultimately, that comes down to the people who are running an organisation. And one of the stories that I often tell about my own career is that I got a break when I was home on parental leave with our second daughter. So Lulu was about 7 months old when I got a private message from a woman on Twitter, Marina Go, who I had admired enormously. And she had started a website, Women's Agenda, about a year before that. And she reached out to me and said, do you want to have a coffee? And I was just beside myself. I was on parental leave at the moment. At that time, I was a journalist at a business magazine. And I went off to have this coffee. And she said to me, look, we're looking for an acting editor of Women's Agenda because the founding editor is having a baby. I'd love you to think about doing this job. And then she said, you've got 2 really small children. I know that childcare is a nightmare. She said that her dad had moved from the Blue Mountains to live with them when their boys were young because they recognised they couldn't both work and have these little kids without having some help at home.
An extra set of hands in the house.
And I didn't have that option for a parent to move to Sydney and move in with into our house. But Marina said to me, think about how you could make this job work for you and we will make that happen. And what that did was I ended up doing 3 short days in the office and with 2 little children. So by the time I started that, I think Lulu was about 9 months old. It was sorted before I even started that I had these little kids, that this is what my working week was going to look like. My output was what mattered, and my output was high because I turned up to work, and when I was at work, I worked really hard and I was thinking about work all the time, even when I was at home with the little kids. So when I got to work,
you could
I
action
could action everything.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I often reflect on this because that is a point for a lot of women where their working lives change quite dramatically. And sometimes that is a genuine choice, but a lot of the time it's not a choice at all. It's just that parents, particularly mothers, are forced to cut back and say, I actually can't do this because the expectations at work do not match with the reality of what my life is. And so I was in this fortunate position of being able to work a few days a week flexibly in a job that was a promotion, and my career was able to grow. It's not as if it sort of soared, but it really grew. My skills grew at exactly the time when a lot of people don't have that option. And the difference, the magical ingredient was having a manager who said to me, Georgie, I know you can do this job. I also know you've got little children and I know that looks different. So let's make it work. And when the starting point is, how do we make this work? So much is possible.
And everybody wins.
Everybody wins. So I think, what do workplaces need to look like? They need to look like managers who start with, how can we make this work? And not just how can we make it work for the individual, how can we make this work for the organisation? I wasn't working for a charity, I was working for a business. I had KPIs I had to meet. But it was so much easier to arrive and thrive when the starting point was, you've got this. Not, I'm going to have to pretend that I haven't got these children. I'm going to sneak out of work and pretend I'm going to a meeting, not going to pick up the kids. And that's really, I often say, I just wish that all of our workplaces were filled with managers who got it. And I think that would make an extraordinary difference to parents in the workplace.
Well, you speak often about the motherhood penalty. Explain that for us. What is that?
So the motherhood penalty is actually a term economists started using when they looked at the income mothers lose, or that women lose after becoming a mother. And it exists in every country. Interestingly, there is a fatherhood bonus. So when men have children, their income on average increases quite significantly. When a woman has a child, her income drops and takes a really long time to recover. So here in Australia, Treasury data from the Treasurer, from the Treasury Department, shows that on average a woman's income drops by 55% when she has a baby, and it doesn't catch up on average for another 10 years. And what the motherhood penalty captures is not just the sort of time out of the workforce, but the ongoing ramifications for your income. So if we think about the average family, maybe mum might have 12 months off when she has a baby, and then she might come back to work 3 or 4 days a week. A lot of the time, women will say, either they'll say it or it's suggested to them, they might come back for a job that's actually got fewer responsibilities. It's less senior, but it might be easier to juggle your family responsibilities. A lot of women are underemployed, where they take a job that is below their skills because it's the one that can work, but often it comes with a significantly lower salary.
It takes 10 years to recover. And then think of the superannuation implications as well, right?
And this is the point. So we know that the beauty of superannuation is compound interest, and superannuation works when people are consistently connected to the paid workforce. And women in Australia have a harder time staying connected to meaningful employment, not because they lack ambition or skills or education or desire, but because it is so hard for them to make it work, because we haven't got adequate paid parental leave. There's still very different expectations of mothers and fathers, and that has a huge impact. So the caring pattern that's set in the first year in a family has a huge impact on that family beyond that, because if dad, for example, takes off a week or 2 weeks when a baby's born and then goes back to work and that's the only paid parental leave they have, there's a lot of evidence that shows the proportion of care given in that first year persists over a child's life. And so that's one of the reasons why it really matters to get dads to have some extended period, even if it's just a month. They're learning the skills of parenting. And then when it comes to both parents being back at work, parenting and caring isn't just something that mum does, it's something that both parents do.
Do you know what grinds my gears, Georgie Dent, is the discussion around women having it all. What is it all?
Yeah.
And is it possible? And why do we even expect it?
So look, it gets me, and I have written many a column over the years on this very topic that, I used to write, why has no male CEO ever been asked how he has it all?
Exactly.
Because when we frame that question around women having it all, the shorthand is really, can you be a man?
Mm-hmm.
Because men have been able to hold all sorts of positions of power and have families, and they've never been asked, can they have it all? And the reason for that is the expectations and realities for men and women are very, very different. And I think there's a lot of different, obviously people have got different experiences, and I cannot speak for every parent out there that is doing their best to get by. Is it possible to raise a family and be a productive member of the workforce? Yes, it absolutely is. Do we make that really hard for a lot of people? Yes, we do.
And what are the sacrifices we make to achieve that?
Yes. So I think it shouldn't be a wild aspiration that we can support not just women but parents to have careers and to raise a family. I don't think they should be incompatible. But I think at the moment for a lot of households they are.
But what does everyone mean by it all anyway? I mean, all of it for you is different for all of it for me,
Yes.
And 1 week you'll feel like you have it all, and the next week you feel like the wheels are off and you're just effing up everything in your entire life. So, what even is it? It's just this insane concept that we're all expected to work towards without knowing exactly what it is and what it looks like.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because there still is a little bit of suspicion, if you like, around women being successful.
Mm.
There is. And I think that question about having it all is often, there's so much unsaid in that expression, because it's almost like we think it's a little bit like, we don't think women should have these crazy ideas about being successful in the workplace, successful in business, or successful in politics, and also have a family. You know, it's a little bit, there is definitely an undercurrent of misogyny
I mean,
there.
if I'm out at a function, right, people often ask me, oh, who's got the kids tonight, right? No one ever asks Pete that. No one says, oh, who's in charge of the kids tonight?
Yes.
You know?
Yes. And that is, there is still so much unspoken assumptions. And actually, this is something that I think people, I was a business reporter for a long time, and I used to interview CEOs and, you know, accountants and lawyers, and a lot of them had spent some time working overseas. And almost invariably, they said they were shocked by the sexism in Australia. So these were people that had worked in the UK, in Europe, in Asia, in the US. We are very rigid in our stereotypes here. We're quite wedded to men as breadwinners and women as caregivers. Even though, as I come back to, the cruel hoax of that is, that's not the economic reality we live in anymore. Families having the option for one person to stay at home is an absolute luxury these days. It is a tiny percentage of the population that have got that option available to them. And yet we still carry on as if a woman striving to have a successful, lucrative career while also raising her family is somehow a little bit illegitimate.
Yeah. To be a bit glass half full on this, though, I think the men of my age and younger are really different with, I mean, my husband, he loves nothing more than being a dad. And he's so involved in their lives. You know, we're a very 50-50 kind of household. And I know that to be true of a lot of my friends' families as well, in our age group. And so I wonder if this is going to shift in the not too distant future, because the men of this generation see parenting as a very different thing and something they want to be involved in.
Yeah, and look, there is absolutely no doubt about that. And one of the things that I would say, again, when we come back to the stories that I hear from families, a lot of men would love to have the option to be more available and more present, and then denied that for a variety of different reasons. Either it's sort of considered unacceptable in their workplace, or in their family, when there's sort of these unspoken assumptions and expectations.
Traditions.
And that's also one of the reasons why at the Parenthood we do champion a paid parental leave scheme that is used by both parents, because if you look at it globally, men in Australia take far less parental leave than dads take globally. And I refuse to believe that's because men in Australia don't want to. I know from the men we speak to, and in an experience similar to yours, socially, anecdotally, it's not necessarily that dads want to live in this 1950s world where all they did was go out to work and come home and then pat the children good night. That's not the world they live in, and it's not the world they want to live in. But we have to, that's why I believe we have to continue fighting for public policy change so that we're actually enabling and supporting men to lean into that role. In the same way we need to be supporting and enabling women to be able to progress in workplaces, we actually need to be enabling and supporting men to stay at home more when they want to and engage in that more.
Before we wrap up, I want to get onto the topic more specifically of childcare. And what is your wish list ultimately with childcare in this country? Because from where I stand, it is a dog's breakfast, the early childcare education system in this country.
Yeah.
There are really great public examples, council-driven examples of early education, but they are really hard to get into, and the vast majority is for profit, and there are issues across that sector. So what does the dream early education sector look like to you?
So at the Parenthood, our ultimate ambition is for children from lower income households to have access to free, quality early childhood education and care, and that all other children should be able to access high quality services for a low set fixed fee, like $10 a day, that would require a different funding model. So at the moment, we've got a childcare subsidy, which is a government-funded subsidy. And what has happened with that is every time the government has put more money into that to make fees more affordable for families, providers put their fees up. So you're absolutely right in identifying that, and this is what the evidence shows. Community-controlled and not-for-profit early childhood education and care services deliver higher standards of quality more consistently. Over the last 5 years, we have seen it's around 95% of new services have been opened by for-profit providers. That's because the childcare subsidy in its current form makes childcare a very attractive investment because it is set government funding. And we do have, we are on the cusp of an election, and depending on what that outcome is, but certainly current Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has said that he would like his ultimate legacy to be universal early education and care, where it is more like school. And that is what at the Parenthood we believe in, because at the moment, if you think about it, a lot of parents say to us the cost of childcare is more expensive than if they sent their child to the local private primary school. But there is no alternative. So when it comes to schools, high school, primary school, parents can make a choice. And if you want to pay high fees and you can pay high fees, you've got those private options available. But if you don't, you've also got the public system. In early education and care, parents do not have the luxury of an abundance of options. They take what they get. The out-of-pocket cost is insanely high in Australia. And so for families, it cripples them. So when we've done surveys, it's only 70% of families who use childcare say the cost is unmanageable.
Yep.
It is akin to a second mortgage. And we believe ultimately we need to move to services themselves being funded directly, which is how a low set fee, like $10 a day, could look like. But certainly the current funding model of the childcare subsidy has led to so many of the problems that you've identified. And again, what we were discussing earlier about how you set children up to thrive, it's about having quality early learning environments that are inclusive, that are staffed by properly paid and professionally trained workforce, like educators and teachers. We lose so much when we have a system that excludes children, either because of cost or lack of access, which is a huge issue that we've got. But we also miss out on a lot if we don't prioritise funding services to a really high quality, because that's where we get the life-changing benefits. And we can quite literally, a child who attends high-quality early education and care will go on to experience higher income, health outcomes, and educational outcomes than a child who doesn't. And that stays with a child for life.
See, this is why you're so good at what you do, because you can explain it in such a calm and diplomatic way, whereas I just get furious. I get furious about this topic because we have set this system up to allow private operators to rake in cash at the expense of the early development of our children. And that's what it boils down to.
Yes.
And that's not to say, there are some wonderful educators in the private system.
Absolutely.
They are all wonderful and they're devoted and they are not paid enough. They're starting to be paid more, but they're still not paid enough. Gosh, I struggle with one of my children for a number of hours, one-on-one. They have to be responsible for dozens of them all day long. It's so intense.
So the thing is, I mentioned this before, that our eldest child is about to turn 15. And it was when she was 1 that I first encountered childcare in Australia. And I have been on a mission since then. And so trust me when I say I have got anger. I have got so much anger. I have channeled it into trying to be a really effective advocate.
You are effective.
For this to be different, because it's not just the child development and educational piece that we're selling short here, but that is really significant. And that is in and of itself a reason to invest in this reform. But the other thing is, and this is really relevant to this podcast, it traps women. So when a family can't afford or access decent childcare, it is women's employment that suffers. And that is not because those women don't need or want the financial security that comes from employment, but it's because they have no other option. And those individual women pay an incredibly high price over the course of their lives when they miss out on the opportunity to stay connected to the workforce, because it's not just the money they might lose in those 6 months, it's the skills they lose, it's the super they lose, it's the sort of diminished value that they're seen to deliver a workplace. So we are selling children and women in particular far too short by not having this system set up adequately.
Thank God you're out there talking about this.
Thank you.
And generating change as well. Look, we've covered a lot of the hard stuff and the topical stuff. But what to you, it's Mother's Day coming up. What is the best thing about being a mum?
Look, I have got 3 girls who are incredibly curious and engaged in the world around them. And I do think that at the moment it is a real joy and a privilege to watch how that plays out. I love having conversations with them. They do make me laugh. They always have. They do drive me absolutely bonkers at different times. And again, I would say this, I was having a conversation with a girlfriend just yesterday, particularly every stage of parenting presents new challenges. And I honestly thought that at this stage in my parenting journey, I would feel like I had it down pat. I do not. I never do. But there is something about that constantly being on your toes that is, it's not dull. It's never a dull moment in my house.
Never. Never. Georgie, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Pleasure.